The dawn had not yet fully broken over the Tyrrhenian Sea, when the roar of Allison Fur 1710 engines filled the humid air at Grottaglie Airfield. It was a morning of thick fog, the kind that clung to skin and made men shiver even under the Mediterranean sun that would soon rise. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt air and damp earth created an atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Flight Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Cartwright stood beside his P-40 Kitty Hawk, running his gloved hand along the worn metal of the fuselage. The shark teeth painted on the nose had faded from countless missions, but they still grinned defiantly at the sky. At 24 years old, Jimmy had the eyes of someone much older, eyes that had seen too many friends fall from the sky, too many empty chairs in the mess hall. "Thinking about home again, mate?" The voice belonged to Flight Sergeant Robert "Bob" Mitchell, Jimmy's wingman and closest friend since training in Australia 2 years ago. Bob was younger by 18 months, but carried himself with the same worn determination that marked all the veterans of No. 3 Squadron or AF. "Always," Jimmy replied, not looking away from his aircraft. "My sister's birthday is next week. She'll be 16. Probably thinks I've forgotten." Bob lit a cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating his tired face. "You'll be there for the next one. This whole thing can't last forever." But both men knew better than to believe such easy promises. The briefing had been short and direct. Operation Avalanche, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno, was underway. American and British forces were hitting the beaches, and the Luftwaffe was responding with everything they had. German Bf-109s and FW-190s were swarming from airfields across southern Italy, and the squadron's mission was clear: establish air superiority, protect the landing forces, and engage any enemy aircraft threatening the beachhead. 23 Kitty Hawks would take off that morning. Not all of them would return. "Pilots, to your aircraft!" Squadron leader Peter Jeffrey's voice cut through the morning haze. He was a man of few words, but infinite respect. A leader who flew at the front and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Jimmy climbed into his cockpit, the familiar ritual grounding him. Buckle the harness, check the instruments, prime the engine, adjust the gun sight. Each motion was muscle memory, performed with the precision of a sacred ceremony. The 450 caliber machine guns and 2 303s felt like extensions of his will. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a symphony of mechanical power. One by one, the other Kitty Hawks awakened, their propellers blurring into invisible discs that pulled at the morning air. "Red Flight, this is Red Leader. Form up on me." Jimmy pushed the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft surge beneath him. The wheels left Italian soil, and for a moment, just a brief, precious moment, there was only the sky and the freedom it promised. They climbed through scattered clouds, the formation tightening as they gained altitude. At 15,000 feet, the Mediterranean spread below them like a wrinkled sheet of blue-gray silk. Somewhere down there, thousands of young men were wading through surf and fire, fighting for every yard of beach. "All aircraft, keep your eyes open. Intelligence reports heavy Luftwaffe activity in this sector." Jimmy's pulse quickened. He scanned the sky with practiced intensity, knowing that in aerial combat, the pilot who sees first lives. The one who doesn't, dies. 15 minutes passed. 20. The tension in Jimmy's shoulders grew with each sweep of his gaze across the empty horizon. Then Bob's voice cracked over the radio, sharp and urgent. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Count 6, no 8, Messerschmitts." Jimmy's heart slammed against his ribs. There they were, black crosses against the pale morning sky, diving toward them like birds of prey. Bf-109G6s, the latest variant, fast and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. "Red Flight, break right. Blue Flight, engage on my mark." The formation shattered into individual duels of speed, altitude, and nerve. Jimmy threw his Kitty Hawk into a hard turn, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the world tilted violently. A Messerschmitt flashed past his canopy, so close he could see the oil stains on its fuselage. The sky became a churning chaos of aircraft, tracer rounds stitching geometric patterns through the air. Jimmy lined up behind a 109, his thumb hovering over the firing button. Lead the target. Breathe. Squeeze. The guns hammered, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Pieces flew from the German fighter's wing, but it rolled away before he could deliver the decisive blow. "Jimmy! Brake left! Brake left!" He reacted before thinking, yanking the stick hard over. Cannon shells tore through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat before. Another 109 screamed past, the German pilot's face visible for a fraction of a second. Young, focused, human. This was the terrible mathematics of aerial combat. Survive by making the other man fail to survive. Jimmy pulled up into a climbing spiral, using the Kitty Hawk's superior turning radius. The 109 tried to follow but couldn't match the turn. Jimmy rolled inverted, pulled through, and suddenly he was on the German's tail. Range, 200 yards, 150, 100. His gun spoke again, and this time the result was unmistakable. Smoke poured from the Messerschmitt's engine. The canopy flew away, and a tiny figure tumbled into the sky, parachute blossoming white against the blue. Jimmy felt no triumph, only the hollow relief of survival. "Red 3 is hit. Red 3 is..." The radio call ended in static. Jimmy's blood ran cold. Red 3 was Bob. He craned his neck, searching frantically through the swirling combat. There, a Kitty Hawk trailing smoke, spiraling downward in a lazy, sickening rotation. And above it, a Focke-Wulf 190, circling like a shark, preparing for another pass. Something primal took over. Jimmy forgot tactics, forgot fuel conservation, forgot everything except the need to protect his friend. He shoved the throttle to the firewall and dove, the airspeed indicator needle climbing past the red line as his aircraft screamed toward the descending fighters. The FW-190 pilot never saw him coming. The world narrowed to a tunnel of speed and fury. Jimmy's Kitty Hawk plummeted through the sky at over 400 miles per hour, the airframe shuddering with the strain. Wind screamed past the canopy as altitude numbers spun backward on his instruments. His vision tunneled at the edges from the negative G-forces, but his focus remained locked on the Focke-Wulf 190 circling above Bob's stricken aircraft. The German pilot was good, experienced. The FW-190 moved with predatory grace, lining up for what would be a finishing pass on the smoking Kitty Hawk below. Jimmy could see Bob's aircraft struggling to maintain control, black smoke streaming from the engine cowling, the propeller windmilling uselessly. Time compressed. Every second felt like an eternity and an instant simultaneously. Jimmy pulled out of his dive at 12,000 feet, the sudden G-forces crushing him into his seat. His vision grayed, then cleared. The FW-190 filled his gun sight. A beautiful, terrible machine painted in mottled gray-green camouflage, its radial engine cowling distinctive and deadly. He didn't radio a warning. There was no honor in this moment, only survival. His thumb found the firing button. The 4.50 caliber machine guns erupted in a synchronized roar. Tracer rounds arced through the air, a glowing stream of metal that converged on the German fighter. The first burst missed, passing just ahead of the Focke-Wulf's nose. Jimmy adjusted, leading the target by a fraction more. The second burst connected. Strikes sparkled along the 190's wing root and fuselage. The German pilot reacted instantly, braking hard left in a violent evasive maneuver. But Jimmy anticipated it, turning inside the German's turn, using every ounce of the Kitty Hawk's agility. For 5 seconds, 10, they spiraled around each other in a deadly dance that had been perfected over countless skies across 3 continents. Each pilot sought the critical advantage: altitude, position, speed, surprise. Each man knew that a single mistake would be his last. The FW-190 had speed and firepower. The Kitty Hawk had maneuverability and a pilot driven by desperate necessity. Jimmy's aircraft shuddered as the Germans' cannon shells passed close, too close. He felt the pressure wave of their passage, heard the crack of displaced air. A glance at his mirror showed the 190 repositioning, its nose searching for him. Come on, Jimmy muttered through gritted teeth, hauling the stick back and rolling inverted. The horizon spun crazily. Sky became sea. Sea became sky. His harness straps bit into his shoulders as he hung in the inverted position for a heartbeat, then pulled through into a descending spiral. The German followed, but the heavier FW-190 couldn't match the turn rate. For a precious moment, Jimmy had the advantage. He fired again, a long, sustained burst that walked across the 190's tail section. Metal tore, control surfaces shredded. The German fighter's smooth flight became erratic, the pilot fighting controls that no longer fully responded. Then, suddenly, the Focke-Wulf broke away, diving toward the east, trailing a thin stream of coolant that caught the morning sun like a silver ribbon. The pilot had made the only decision that made sense: survive to fight another day. Jimmy didn't pursue. His fuel gauge was dancing near the red, and Bob needed him more than victory over a retreating enemy. Bob, do you read me? Static. Then, weakly. I'm here, Jimmy. Engine's done. Lost oil pressure. Can't maintain altitude. Jimmy's heart, which had been pounding with combat adrenaline, now clenched with a different kind of fear. He dropped beside Bob's crippled Kitty Hawk, matching its descending spiral. The damage was worse than he'd thought. Bullet holes stitched across the engine, cowling and wing. Black smoke had turned to orange flames licking back from the engine compartment. You need to bail out. Now, Bob. Trying. Canopy's jammed. Something's bent. Terror gripped Jimmy. A jammed canopy meant Bob was trapped in a falling, burning aircraft. The mathematics were simple and cruel. Less than 8,000 feet of altitude remained, and they were losing 1,000 feet per minute. Use the emergency release, the red handle by your left knee. Already tried. It's not... Wait, I've got movement. Jimmy flew as close as he dared, watching his friend struggle in the smoke-filled cockpit. Through the scratched Perspex canopy, he could see Bob's silhouette working frantically at something. The flames were growing, spreading back along the fuselage. The Kitty Hawk had maybe a minute before the fire reached the fuel tanks. 5,000 feet. Bob, you're running out of time. I know, just almost 4,000 feet. The canopy suddenly flew away, tumbling behind the doomed aircraft. Bob stood up in the cockpit, the wind tearing at his flight suit, his face pale but determined even from this distance. He looked across at Jimmy. Just looked. For one long moment that contained everything. Friendship, fear, gratitude, farewell. Then he jumped. Jimmy watched, his breath frozen in his lungs, as Bob's body tumbled away from the dying aircraft. 1 second. 2. 3. The parachute blossomed, a perfect white flower against the blue canvas of sky and sea. Relief flooded through Jimmy so intensely he felt dizzy. Below, the abandoned Kitty Hawk continued its death spiral, finally impacting the water in a white splash that quickly dissipated. Bob drifted downward, his parachute carrying him toward the Mediterranean waters below. Red Leader, this is Red 2. Red 3 has bailed out successfully. Position approximately 12 miles off Salerno beachhead. Understood, Red 2. Mark the location. Will vector rescue. But even as Squadron Leader Jeffrey's voice came through with reassurance, Jimmy saw something that turned his blood to ice. Another formation of aircraft was approaching from the north. 10 Messerschmitt 109s, flying in a tight V formation at about 16,000 feet, and they were heading directly toward Bob's parachute. The Luftwaffe pilots would have seen the combat, seen the parachute deploy. Some pilots, on both sides, respected the unwritten rule: don't attack a man in a parachute. But others saw parachuting pilots as future enemies who would fly again if rescued. Jimmy's fuel gauge showed just enough for maybe 15 minutes of combat flying. His ammunition counters showed less than 30 seconds of firing time remaining across all 6 guns. He was alone, outnumbered 10-1, low on everything except determination. The rational decision was clear. Mark Bob's position, climb to altitude, rejoin the squadron, and let the rescue boats do their job. But Jimmy Cartwright had never been particularly rational when it came to protecting the people he loved. He pushed the throttle forward, pointing his Kitty Hawk's nose toward the approaching formation. The engine responded with a throaty roar that sounded almost eager, His hand rested on the stick with the familiar weight of purpose. "Sorry, Bob," he whispered to the empty cockpit. "But I'm not leaving you now." The Messerschmitts grew larger in his windscreen, their black crosses becoming more distinct with each passing second. 10 against 1. Impossible odds. But impossible had never stopped an Australian from trying. The 10 Messerschmitts didn't scatter when they saw Jimmy's lone Kitty Hawk climbing toward them. Instead, they tightened their formation, a sign of disciplined, veteran pilots who knew their numerical advantage. Jimmy could see the lead aircraft clearly now, a 109 G6 with yellow identification bands on its nose and fuselage, marking it as belonging to Jagdgeschwader 53, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings. His radio crackled. "Red 2, this is Red Leader. What are you doing? Break off and return to base." Jimmy pressed the transmit button, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Negative, Red Leader. Red 3 is in the water directly below the bandit's flight path. I'm engaging to buy time for rescue." A pause. Then Squadron Leader Jeffrey's voice came back, tinged with something that might have been pride, might have been resignation. "Understood, Red 2. Blue flight is 10 minutes out. Hold them as long as you can." 10 minutes. An eternity in aerial combat. The Messerschmitt formation began to split. 4 aircraft maintaining altitude while 6 descended in pairs. Classic tactics. The high group would hold energy advantage while the low group engaged. Then they'd swap positions. Jimmy was facing not just 10 aircraft, but 10 pilots who knew exactly what they were doing. His mind raced through calculations. Limited ammunition, low fuel, 1 gun against 60. The only advantage he possessed was position. He was between the Germans and Bob's parachute, now drifting at about 3,000 feet, still 4 minutes from hitting the water. 4 minutes to hold back 10 fighters. The first pair of 109s came at him head-on, a test of nerve. 2 aircraft converging on 1, a deadly game of chicken played at a combined closure rate of over 600 miles per hour. Jimmy could see the muzzle flashes from their guns, watched the tracer rounds reaching toward him like luminous fingers. He held his course for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Every instinct screamed to break away, to dive, to evade. But breaking meant opening the path to Bob. At the last possible moment, Jimmy fired a short burst and rolled inverted, pulling down and away. The 2 Messerschmitts flashed overhead so close that their prop wash buffeted his aircraft. He caught a glimpse of one pilot's face, older, weathered, mustached, a veteran who'd probably been flying since Poland or France. "Close one, mate," Jimmy breathed, leveling out at 9,000 feet. But there was no time to catch his breath. Another pair was already diving on him from the left, and the high cover was repositioning for their run. Jimmy threw his Kitty Hawk into a hard right turn, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. His vision grayed at the edges, but he kept pulling, using the tighter turning radius to spiral inside the Germans' attack. Tracer rounds laced the sky around him. He felt impacts, hard thumps that resonated through the airframe. His right wing, maybe the fuselage. No time to assess damage. He reversed his turn, pulling so hard that his vision tunneled completely for a moment, seeing only through a pinhole of consciousness. When his vision cleared, he was somehow behind one of the Messerschmitts. Pure instinct took over. He lined up the shot, led the target, and pressed the firing button. His guns hammered out a 2-second burst. Strikes walked across the 109's tail and fuselage. The German fighter rolled away, trailing smoke, but not critically hit. Jimmy's ammunition counter showed he had maybe 3 more bursts before his guns went silent. 3 bursts, 9 aircraft still hunting him. "Red 2, blue flight is 8 minutes out. Can you hold?" Jimmy glanced down. Bob's parachute was at 2,000 feet now, swinging gently in the sea breeze. So close to the water, so close to relative safety. But 2 of the Messerschmitts had broken away from engaging Jimmy and were descending toward the parachute. His decision took less than a heartbeat. Jimmy rolled inverted and dove, trading altitude for speed, plummeting after the 2 109s that threatened his friend. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. The airframe groaned. Rivets somewhere in the wings creaked ominously. The 2 German pilots saw him coming. One broke left, the other right. A defensive split that would normally force an attacker to choose one target and leave himself vulnerable to the other. But Jimmy wasn't trying to destroy them. He only needed to disrupt their attack run on Bob. He fired at the left-hand 109, a long burst that mostly missed but served its purpose. The German pilot broke off his approach to the parachute, climbing away to rejoin the fight. The second 109, seeing his wingman engaged, also abandoned the parachute run. But Jimmy's victory was momentary. He dived from 9,000 feet to 4,000 feet, burning altitude and speed. Now 8 Messerschmitts were above him, holding every advantage. His ammunition counter read enough for perhaps 2 short bursts. Below, Bob's parachute touched the water. Jimmy saw his friend detach from the harness and begin inflating his life vest. Safe, for now. The rescue boats would find him if Jimmy could just buy a few more minutes. The Messerschmitts regrouped, circling above him like wolves around a wounded deer. Jimmy climbed, trying to regain altitude, but the 109s were faster in the climb. They were boxing him in, cutting off escape routes, herding him into a killing position. His radio crackled with a new voice, accented English, transmitted on the combat frequency. Australian pilot, you fight bravely for your comrade, but this is finished. Turn south and go home. We will not follow. Jimmy looked up at the circling fighters. It was an offer, rare in the brutal calculus of aerial warfare. Honor between enemies, a chance to survive. He thought of his sister's birthday next week. His mother's letters that came every month, each one pretending to be cheerful while begging him to be careful. His father, who'd flown Bristol fighters in the previous war and who'd understand both the choice Jimmy faced and the choice he'd have to make. He thought of Bob, floating in the water below, watching the sky above him where his fate was being decided. Jimmy pressed the transmit button. Thanks for the offer, Jerry. But I'm staying. A long pause. Then, almost with what sounded like respect, so be it. The Messerschmitts dove as one, a coordinated attack from multiple angles designed to overwhelm any defense. Jimmy's hands moved across the controls with the practiced grace of a concert pianist, throwing his aircraft through maneuvers that pushed both machine and man to their absolute limits. Roll left, pull up, spiral right, snap roll, dive, climb. A 3-dimensional ballet where the price of a misstep was death. His guns fell silent. Out of ammunition. But still he flew, still he maneuvered, placing his aircraft between the Germans and Bob. He became not a fighter, but a shield, using his Kitty Hawk's body to block their firing solutions, trading his own survival for seconds of time. Impacts hammered his aircraft. The canopy starred with cracks. The engine began to run rough, oil pressure dropping. Smoke, his own this time, began to stream behind him. Red 2, blue flight is 3 minutes out. 3 minutes. Jimmy's engine was failing. His controls were sluggish, something critical damaged. He was at 6,000 feet, losing altitude with each passing second. The Messerschmitt circled, lining up for what would certainly be the final pass. Then, like angels appearing through clouds, he saw them. 8 Kitty Hawks, diving out of the sun with guns blazing. Blue Flight had arrived early, pushing their engines beyond safe limits to reach the fight. The Messerschmitts, suddenly outnumbered and with their fuel gauges low, broke off the engagement. Within seconds, the sky that had been filled with enemies was empty except for the friendly fighters forming up around Jimmy's damaged aircraft. Red 2, this is Blue Leader. We've got you. Head home. Jimmy tried to respond, but his voice wouldn't come. Exhaustion crashed over him like a wave. His hands were shaking on the controls. His shirt was soaked with sweat. Every muscle in his body ached from the sustained G-forces, but Bob was safe. The rescue boat was already moving toward his position. Jimmy's engine coughed, then caught again. Barely. He nursed the throttle, coaxing every last bit of power from the wounded Allison engine. Grottaglie Airfield was 30 miles away. It might as well have been on the moon. Just get me home, he whispered to his aircraft. Just a little further. The Kitty Hawk, as if understanding, kept flying. The Kitty Hawk flew like a wounded bird, each mile an act of faith over physics. Black smoke trailed behind Jimmy's aircraft in an unbroken line across the sky, a marker visible for miles that told anyone watching that this machine was dying. The oil pressure gauge had dropped into the red zone 10 minutes ago. The temperature gauge had climbed past its safe limits. The engine knocked and rattled, with sounds no aircraft engine should ever make. Jimmy's hands remained steady on the controls, though exhaustion made his arms feel like lead weights. Blue Flight maintained formation around him, shepherding him home like protective brothers. Their presence was both comforting and sobering. Pilots only flew that close to a damaged aircraft when they expected it to fall from the sky at any moment. Red 2, this is Blue Leader. How's she handling? Jimmy tested the controls gently. The stick felt mushy, the aircraft responding sluggishly to his inputs. He could feel the airframe vibrating in ways that suggested structural damage beyond what he could see. Like flying a brick wrapped in prayers, he replied, managing a ghost of his usual humor. But she's still flying. Through the cracked canopy, Jimmy could see the Italian coastline growing closer. The morning sun had burned away the early fog, revealing the patchwork of fields and villages below. It looked peaceful from up here, almost serene. Nothing like the chaos of the beachhead at Salerno where men were still fighting and dying. 15 miles to the airfield. The engine coughed, and for a heart-stopping moment, the propeller jerked to a halt. Jimmy's breath caught. Then, miraculously, it caught again, the engine firing on what sounded like maybe 4 of its 12 cylinders. Each rotation seemed to cost the mechanism something vital. "You've got this, girl," Jimmy murmured to his aircraft, patting the instrument panel like it was a living thing. In a way, it was. The Kitty Hawk had personality, spirit. She'd taken punishment that should have torn her apart and kept flying. Just a little further. His mind drifted as he flew, the adrenaline that had sustained him through combat now fading, leaving behind a hollowed-out exhaustion. He thought of Bob, probably being pulled into a rescue boat right now, cold and soaked but alive. He thought of the German pilot who'd offered him safe passage, a moment of humanity in the midst of inhuman violence. He thought of his crew chief, Sergeant Davies, who would have a fit when he saw what Jimmy had done to his carefully maintained aircraft. Most of all, he thought of home. The eucalyptus trees along the creek behind his family's house in Brisbane. The sound of kookaburras at dawn. His sister Mary's laugh. Sunday dinners with the smell of his mother's roast filling the house. Normal things. Impossibly distant things. 10 miles. The coastline passed beneath them. They were over land now, over Allied territory. The psychological relief was immense, though it changed nothing about the aircraft's condition. If he had to bail out now, at least he'd land among friends, rather than spending the rest of the war in a POW camp. Red 2, Grottaglie Tower. We have you visual. Crash cruiser standing by. Runway is clear. You're cleared for straight-in approach. Jimmy acknowledged, his voice hoarse. Through the haze ahead, he could make out the airfield, a brown scar in the green landscape with its single runway pointing like an arrow toward salvation. It looked impossibly far away and impossibly small. 5 miles. The engine's death rattle grew louder. Oil was now coating his windscreen, making visibility even worse through the already cracked canopy. He wiped at it uselessly with his gloved hand, only smearing it further. The oil pressure gauge had gone to 0. He was flying on nothing but momentum and borrowed time. Blue Flight peeled away, giving him room to approach. "Bring her home, Jimmy," Blue Leader called. "You've got this." 3 miles. The airfield was growing larger now, but so was Jimmy's understanding of how little control he actually had. The engine was making sounds like tearing metal. The aircraft wanted to roll left. Something damaged in the aileron controls, perhaps. Each correction felt like wrestling a stubborn mule. 2 miles. He began his descent, dropping the landing gear. The hydraulic system groaned but responded, 3 green lights confirming that the wheels were down and locked. Small mercies. At least he wouldn't have to belly land. 1 mile. The engine seized. Not a gradual failure, but a sudden, catastrophic stop. One moment it was running, barely. And the next it was silent except for the whistle of wind through the damaged cowling. The propeller stopped, locked in place, now creating drag instead of thrust. Jimmy's heart hammered, but his hands remained steady. He'd trained for this. Dead stick landings, gliding a several-ton aircraft with no power, using gravity and aerodynamics alone. The airfield was right there, so close. He could make this. He adjusted his angle of approach, using every foot of altitude with miserly precision. Too steep and he'd hit short of the runway. Too shallow and he'd never reach it. The margin for error was measured in degrees and seconds. The Kitty Hawk glided over the airfield boundary, dropping like a stone now, the runway rushing up to meet him. He could see the crash crews positioned alongside, fire trucks and ambulances waiting. He could see the other pilots standing outside the dispersal hut, watching. 50 feet. 40. 30. The ground rose to embrace his aircraft. Jimmy pulled back on the stick, flaring for landing, bleeding off speed while trying to keep the nose up. The main wheels touched first, a hard jolt that traveled up his spine. The tail wheel dropped. He was down. But momentum carried them forward at 70 miles per hour with no engine to reverse thrust, and brakes damaged from combat. The end of the runway approached with alarming speed. Beyond it, a ditch and a stone wall. Jimmy stood on the brakes, feeling them grab weakly, inconsistently. The Kitty Hawk slowed, but not fast enough. 50 yards from the runway's end. 40. 30. He made a decision. Better to ground loop the aircraft, deliberately spin it, than to hit that wall head-on. He kicked the rudder hard while applying differential braking, forcing the tail around. The Kitty Hawk pivoted, tires screaming against the concrete, the wounded airframe groaning in protest. The world spun, once, twice. Then they were stopped, facing backward on the runway, 20 yards from the end. Smoke rose from the tortured tires and brakes. But they were stopped. They were down. They were alive. For a long moment, Jimmy just sat there, his hands still gripping the stick, his body unwilling to believe the danger had passed. Then, with trembling fingers, he began shutting down the systems. Magnetos off, fuel off, battery off. The ritual of ending a flight, performed with the same care as beginning one. The canopy, what remained of it, slid back. Fresh air, blessed and cool, rushed in to replace the smell of oil and smoke and fear. Jimmy unbuckled his harness with numb fingers, stood on shaking legs, and climbed down from the cockpit. Sergeant Davies was the first to reach him, the crew chief's face torn between relief and horror as he took in the damage to his aircraft. Bullet holes stitched across the fuselage and wings, the engine cowling torn apart, the tail riddled with punctures. A miracle it had flown at all, let alone made it home. "Sir," Davies said, his voice tight. "What did you do to my airplane?" Jimmy looked at the wreck that had saved his life, at the brave machine that had refused to quit even when it should have. "She brought me home, Davies. That's all that matters." Squadron leader Jeffrey approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jimmy thought he might be in for a reprimand. He'd disobeyed orders, engaged impossible odds, nearly lost an aircraft and pilot. But then Jeffrey extended his hand. "Good work, Lieutenant. Bob's aboard the rescue boat. He'll be back before dinner." Relief, pure and overwhelming, washed through Jimmy. His knees almost buckled. Bob was safe. They'd both made it home. Other pilots crowded around, offering congratulations and good-natured ribbing about his landing. Someone pressed a canteen of water into his hands. Someone else offered a cigarette. Jimmy accepted both, his hands still shaking as he lit the cigarette. The debriefing would come later. The questions about the engagement, the estimates of enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged, the formal documentation that turned human experience into military records. Later would come the nightmares, the delayed reaction as his mind processed what he'd been through. Later would come the letters home, carefully worded to hide the worst from people who loved him. But for now, in this moment, standing on solid ground with the sun on his face and his squadron around him, Jimmy Cartwright allowed himself something rare and precious in wartime. Simple gratitude for being alive. A truck approached from the base, and from it emerged Bob, soaking wet, wrapped in blankets, but grinning like a fool. He jogged over and threw his arms around Jimmy in a fierce embrace. "You absolute madman," Bob said, his voice rough with emotion. "You took on 10 of them. 10. Couldn't let you have all the fun swimming," Jimmy replied, returning the embrace. They stood there for a moment, two young men far from home who'd faced death together and survived. Around them, the war continued. More missions would be flown. More lives would be lost. The fight for Italy had only begun, and the road to victory stretched long and hard ahead. But on this morning, September 10th, 1943, on a dusty airfield in southern Italy, the Australian aces of No. 3 Squadron RAF had met the Luftwaffe and dominated the sky. Not through superior numbers or equipment, but through courage, skill, and the bonds of brotherhood that made men willing to risk everything for each other. As the medical officer led Bob away for examination, and the ground crew began the solemn task of assessing whether Jimmy's Kitty Hawk could ever fly again, Jimmy took one last look at the aircraft that had saved his life. She would probably never see combat again. Too damaged, too worn. But she'd done her duty and more. "Thank you," he whispered to the silent machine. "Thank you for bringing us home." The Kitty Hawk stood silent on the runway, shark teeth still grinning defiantly, a warrior at rest after battle. And somewhere in the Mediterranean sky, the ghosts of the day's combat slowly faded into memory, becoming the stories that would be told in quiet moments, when old pilots gathered to remember the days when they were young, and the world was at war, and they flew like angels through the deadly heavens.